Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of Lawfare Live, National Security and the 2024 election. There are a lot of places you can go for your poll updates, for your sense of what's going on in the battleground states, for your reporting on what the candidates are doing, what the latest outrageous thing they've said. We're not doing any of that here. You got major networks for that. You've got here at Lawfare relentlessly substantive coverage of the issues in the context of the campaign. And today we are talking about tech policy. What can we reasonably expect from a Harris administration in the tech policy arena? What can we reasonably expect from a second Trump administration in issues like AI governance, cybersecurity? Who's going to ban and who's going to protect TikTok? What about content moderation and all that stuff? And who is going to break up big tech companies? We're going to talk about it all. I am joined today, in order of where they appear on my screen, by the estimable Kevin Frazier, the estimable Eugenia Lostri, the estimable Alan Rozenshtein, the estimable Quinta Jurecic, and the estimable Kate Klonick. So we are going to get started. Let's start with what I think, Alan Rozenshtein, is the simplest question, which is not to say that it's simple at all, which is TikTok. We have a law on the books that says TikTok's going to be broken up. We have has to be sold to an American company or be banned. We have a Trump candidate who issued an order trying to ban TikTok back when he was president, but seems to say something else now. And we have a Harris who is part of an administration that signed this law. What do we know?
Yeah, well, a lot of what we know depends on what happens with the DC Circuit, which heard a challenge to this law. Um, I think last month. Obviously, we won't know what they say until they say it. My read of the opinion was that it went quite poorly for TikTok, and I suspect it is more likely than not that TikTok will lose. It will at least lose 2-1. I actually would not be surprised if it loses 3-0. Ultimately, this is the sort of case that's going to go straight to the Supreme Court. So we'll have to see what the Supreme Court says. I think the Supreme Court will also uphold the law. And so the question is, I mean, obviously, again, if the Supreme Court strikes down this law, I think this law is going to go away. I think the fever to ban TikTok will have probably broken in Congress, and I don't think Congress will try to do anything else to sort of get at TikTok in some other way. So the question is, okay, what happens if the law is upheld? What, if anything, can the Trump or Harris administrations do? I think the Harris administration is a simpler case. I don't see any reason to think that Harris would try to undermine the law that Biden supported and passed. Um, so then the real question is, what would Trump do? Now, Trump is this, wild cannon on all these things. He's lately come out against the law and pro TikTok, largely because, well, I mean, it's not even clear what his stated reason is. It's pretty clear that this is just entirely because one of his major donors is a big investor in ByteDance and would obviously lose a lot of money if TikTok were to be banned. So this seems just like the purest of transactional politics, which is, I don't know, it's almost refreshing in its mercenary nature. It's notable because, of course, in the first Trump administration, Trump tried to ban TikTok via executive order. This was struck down on statutory grounds as exceeding the president's power. But it's quite a remarkable flip-flop. So the question is, what if anything, could Trump do? Now, the law does not actually give the president much of a role at all in the banning of TikTok specifically. So the law is two parts. It bans TikTok, or it requires ByteDance to divest of TikTok. And then it also provides that for future platforms that are owned by certain foreign entities, the president can start a divestment process. But for TikTok in particular, the law just outright applies. It doesn't really give the president a role beyond extending the divestment deadline by 90 days if the president thinks that the law that a divestment is ongoing. So I don't really think there's anything the president can do to save TikTok from the divestment. The president, could certify that a divestment has happened, even if a divestment has not happened. That would be interesting. I don't know if that would legally stand up in court. That gets into all these interesting standing questions. Or the president could simply say, I'm directing my attorney general, not to enforce the law against the regulated parties here, not TikTok actually, but the ISPs or the platforms like Apple and Google that would host the TikTok app. But of course, if I'm the general counsel of Apple, and Tim Cook asks me in June, once this law has gone into effect, assuming the Supreme Court has upheld it, hey, should we continue to host TikTok on the App Store, given that Trump has, I don't know, tweeted some crazy thing about not enforcing the law? I, general counsel, would say absolutely not. You can't trust Trump. We should under no circumstances be in a position of an ongoing violation of this law just because Trump has tweeted about how at the moment he promises not to go after us. So really, I think the only thing Trump can do, again, assuming that the Supreme Court upholds the law, is to get Congress to repeal the law. But I don't think, frankly, there are the votes for that. So,
and to be clear, do you not think there are the votes for that because you think that the vote was overwhelming and people aren't going to reverse themselves just because Donald Trump has a transactional relationship with some TikTok investors, or is the theory of it that presumably if he, what if he cared and put some political muscle behind it? Is the assumption here that he wouldn't do that?
Yeah, I think part of it is that this passed overwhelmingly, and so you need a lot of people who just voted for this bill to reverse themselves. Some would on Trump's request, but I don't think enough would, and I don't think you'd get a filibuster-proof majority to, and I don't think this is why the Republicans are going to blow up the filibuster. Now, it's true that if Trump really cared, maybe he could twist enough arms, but he'd have to care. And he's very bad at caring about things. He's very, very bad about actually doing things to completion. And once he's won the election, who cares? He doesn't need this donor anymore. Remember, it's entirely, it's transactional turtles all the way down with Donald Trump. And even if he did care, in order for this thing to be unwound, this would probably have to be like HR 1. And this would be one of the very first things that Congress passes. And they have way more important priorities, like gutting the civil service or repealing the two-term ban on the presidency or something like that. So I think even if Trump wins, there's very unlikely that this law will be repealed or modified in a way that will really help TikTok.
And
this kind of
sorry, go ahead.
Yep. I just kind of wanted to ask a really quick question to you, Alan, because I followed your coverage of this, of your live tweeting of it, which was excellent during the trial in the DC circuit. So as far as I know, they have until January. That hasn't been extended at all for the divestment. But ByteDance has also said that they're just not going to divest. There's no way that they're going to do it. So just in terms of timing, what is going to happen in terms of the president, in terms of the executive being sworn in, Congress being sworn in by the time the divestment takes place? I just think you kind of glossed over that really quickly, and I actually don't know the exact dates, but January 17th sticks in my mind for some reason for the divestment, but I could be wrong about that.
No, I think that's right. And again, if ByteDance keeps saying, look, we're not going to divest, we're not going to divest, we're not going to divest, the president's not going to extend 90 days because that requires there to be an ongoing divestment negotiation. And I don't think Biden has any interest in this, especially since he's leaving office. So he's kind of not responsible for this. I think the question is, and this is sort of a procedural question that I've been thinking about, I just know the answer to, let's say the DC Circuit rules against TikTok, and then TikTok and ByteDance appeal to the Supreme Court. They're going to presumably ask for a stay, right? And I think the Supreme Court will probably give it to them, even though the requirements for a stay are that you have a high likelihood of winning on the merits. And I think I think And I don't think there's such a high likelihood. And the reason for that is because the Supreme Court, I think, even though I think it's ultimately going to uphold the law, recognizes that if you let TikTok be banned, even for a month, even for a week, you have caused a huge disruption that TikTok may never recover from, based on the nature of these social media platforms, right? Because once everyone moves to Threads, moves to not Threads, Reels, whatever Instagram's version of this is, that's it. It's game over for TikTok. They're never going to get that audience back. So I think the Supreme Court will probably stay whatever the DC Circuit says, and it's sort of enjoying the law and whatever the case is. I don't know the technical terminology. I'm not a Fed courts person. Until it ultimately decides sometime in the summer, right? And then the question is going to be, in the summer, when the Supreme Court, let's say, upholds the law, will the ban go into effect immediately, or will the Supreme Court toll the divestment period such that ByteDance gets another month or something? Now that it knows, oh wow, we've really lost. Now it really is divestment or bust. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, so just to kind of like, that's exactly my calculation, by the way. Like what you kind of spelled out there with the civil procedure. And I think that this is kind of an interesting, what I think is so interesting about this question is, of course, like, okay, so there's the one kind of chess game of the stays and the appeals and everything else. And then there's like the economic realities of what TikTok is facing as a business matter, right? And then of course there's the political reality that's swirling around all of this that that you kind of opened with. But what I'm really interested in too is like the second bite at the apple that TikTok might get in hearing, getting either, getting to the Supreme Court and getting heard on the merits again, to a certain extent. And I'm curious if you think how reflective. I didn't listen. I wasn't in the same time zone. So like, how reflective do you think the DC Circuit's arguments were of what the court will do?
I think the DC Circuit's going to write a pretty good first draft of what the ultimate Supreme Court opinion is going to be.
Yeah, me too.
I think TikTok's going to lose, and I think that although I'm in the minority of law professors who think this, I think it is increasingly clear that it's going to lose.
And the one last dorky question I'll ask is like, what do you think the chances are for appointing like a special master or having the DC Circuit do any type of like fact finding around this?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the background here is that a bunch of the government's case, both in Congress, but then in particular the DC Circuit, is classified. Again, we don't know what's in that information, but I assume that it's probably signals or human intelligence with respect not to the Chinese government's control over ByteDance and TikTok. If there was a smoking gun evidence, we'd have known that by now, but probably some evidence of just how enmeshed the Chinese government is with sort of other similarly situated private companies. And the government will not release that because China is an incredibly hard target intel-wise, and they don't want to do anything that could possibly burn a source or a method. And this raises a problem for TikTok because now it's in the position of trying to litigate on the basis of secret evidence, like that it can't even dispute. And so it asked the DC Circuit to potentially appoint a special master that would, it's unclear what the special master would do exactly. It's like a bespoke SEPA for civil litigation for one case. The whole thing's very complicated.
It's really complicated, especially because like the DC Circuit is like, is it a circuit? Is it a trial? Like there's nothing below it. So it's a very weird little like kind of problem question, I think.
Exactly. This is the sort of thing that in any other case I would just dismiss out of hand. But I actually wrote a Lawfare piece, co-wrote one with our former intern Julian Berman, arguing that actually this is probably, of all the cases to appoint a special master, this is probably the case to do it. And I was really, when I was listening to the oral argument, was really looking for any sense from the DC Circuit that they were uncomfortable having to rule on the basis of secret evidence, and I heard literally nothing about that, which makes me think that this special master stuff's not going anywhere. The DC Circuit will do everything in camera. They'll be very comfortable with that. And if they're comfortable with that, then the Supreme Court will be comfortable with that, because they're essentially going to treat the DC Circuit's review of the record as a trial court review. Not literally, again, all the Fed courts people don't yell at me. But for their purposes, the Supreme Court will be satisfied that, Srinivasan and Rao and Ginsburg, right? 3 super distinguished judges have done a really hard look at the evidence, and that's satisfying enough to the justices.
And Alan, I had the great pleasure of editing one of your pieces, as well as moderating a podcast with you and some other members of the Academy. And I'm curious to hear why you think other law professors may be guessing that this isn't going to be decided against TikTok? What's sort of the counter argument? So that's one side of one question for you. The second would be, I think you and I are aligned that the Supreme Court and the DC Circuit is really going to lean into this from a national security separation of powers perspective, of going back to that sort of deference to Congress when taking on as meaty of issues as China interference. Is that the dominant narrative that you think is going to pervade the opinion, or do you think it's going to turn on different crowds?
Yeah, I'll answer the second question first. I mean, I think it's going to be the national security case. I mean, that's the only way that this is constitutional. I mean, if this were a domestic case, this would be flagrantly, obviously, 1,000,000% unconstitutional, right? There's no question about that, right? The only reason that this is even plausibly constitutional is because this is a national security case. And so it's just going to be, I mean, I joked that the DC Circuit opinion is going to be 20 pages of China, 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 you know, like a Bart Simpson style, right, over and over again. And I think the Supreme Court is going to be that, right, with the occasional citation to Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. As to your first question, look, I don't want to like call anyone out or anything like that. And you know, look, I'm making very confident predictions, and we'll see if I'm right about it. I'll say two things. One is I think that, you know, I really felt like I was in a lonely minority before the DC Circuit. That was fine, right? That meant that I got to be the guy making the argument, right? Which is like good. I think after the DC Circuit, there are a lot of people who are beginning to grudgingly agree with me as a descriptive matter, right? Even though they think that this is a terrible, you know, outcome, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm one of those people.
Fair enough, right? And as to why people were very confident that this was going to go nowhere, or that the law is going to be struck unconstitutional. I mean, look, people have different views of the First Amendment. I think there's a little bit of projection among First Amendment scholars, frankly, confusing what they want to be with what is. But look, again, I don't want to call anyone out. We all do that with our pet issues, and you know, for whatever reason.
Check out that immunity decision.
Yeah, yikes. Yeah, exactly. Yes,
I don't think it's just that.
I very confidently wrote that the Supreme Court is going to rule against Donald Trump. So, you know, you win some, you lose some.
Yeah, I don't think that it's just the kind of your pet issue. I just think that like it's hard. You have two very strong doctrinal topics going head to head in each other with a national security and a First Amendment case. And so if you're used to like usually the First Amendment winning when it's faces like, you know, a tribunal like this, then like I think that's it's not surprising that people who are more familiar with the First Amendment would think that. And I don't know, but like maybe the only other thing that is that the government is more in favor of these days is you know, these NatSec arguments being an excuse to violate the First Amendment. And so here we are. And so I mean, yeah, I think that but your point taken, I was one of the people who vehemently disagreed with you a number of months ago, and now I'm coming around, and I'm a little sad about it. So we will see.
Yeah, I think it helps that I was a former. I mean, I mean this seriously. I think it helps that I, for several years, was a literally national security deep state lawyer, and so perhaps I come to these with just a different perspective.
Coming around, but a little sad about it. Sounds like, you know, a ballad by, I don't know, Taylor Swift or Johnny Cash or something.
I'd listen to that.
All right. I got one more question on this subject, Alan, which is about the law. You started by saying, you know, there's actually, if Trump is inclined to stop a TikTok ban, there's not really a provision in the law for that. So my question is, what is the mechanism in the law in which by which the ban is executed? Who does it? And, you know, presumably somebody in the executive branch now has to say TikTok is banned. And how is that going to be effectuated within the executive branch if it comes to that?
Oh, no, you're asking me detailed questions. I don't have that. So I should have pulled the law up in front of me. If my recollection is that the law is aimed at, I mean, the law is not enforced against TikTok and ByteDance. It's enforced against the platforms that would host the app and the ISPs that would provide the service. And so I think it's civil penalties brought by the federal government.
So it really is the federal government doesn't really have to do anything because Apple and Google and the various app stores are like, oh, it's now illegal to be distributing TikTok, so we're just going to kick it off our system. And there's really no executive branch function unless one of them defies it, in which case they could seek an enforcement action.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, so that is a textbook lesson there, Congress, in how to marginalize the president. All right, let's move on to the next subject, cybersecurity. Again, there's going to be a major theme here, which is Trump says all kinds of crazy things. The actual record of his administration is a little bit different, a little bit more complicated. So, Eugenia, at a broad level of altitude, how would you characterize the record of the Trump administration on cybersecurity matters and the continuity or disjuncture that followed it when the Biden administration took over the cybersecurity portfolio?
So I think you just said it, Ben, right? We can look at some of the crazy things that are said. I think before you mentioned like the Trump Putin like invincible cyber unit or something like that, which didn't really go anywhere. But when we look at what actually went through during the Trump administration, it was all pretty standard. We got the defend forward strategy. You had a bunch of executive orders on strengthening cybersecurity or addressing malicious cyber-enabled activities. You had a lot of activity from CISA, even though at the end of the Trump administration, that kind of devolved after Chris Krebs, who was the director, made some, he insisted the election had been secure, and that, really upset Trump. But looking at the Biden administration, they actually built a lot on many of those executive orders. Their national cybersecurity strategy references them, implements them. There is a continuation of the work. I think, it's fairly common to say that cybersecurity is mostly nonpartisan. And I think you see that. There's some common concerns about foreign interference. There's concerns about supply chain, and there's concerns about how to protect critical infrastructure, and those are maintained, from administration to administration. And I think we're likely to see some of those continue to be priorities, regardless of who wins.
All right, so let's talk again. The putative Harris administration is an easier thing to predict and talk about because, she's more or less a conventional Democrat. My impression is that there has just been an enormous amount of cybersecurity work done in the Biden administration, and that's a function of the growth and seriousness of CISA under Jen Easterly, also the work done at the White House itself by Ann Neuberger, and a whole lot of policy making at NIST. I don't know Joe Biden to have particularly strong feelings or instincts about cybersecurity. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. But I do have the impression that this has been a particularly productive administration in the cybersecurity arena. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. I think cybersecurity has taken, quite a, it has been in the spotlight, right? You see not only the expansion of CISA, you have ONC, the Office of the National Cyber Director, or NCD. This has been lifted up as a priority at the State Department as well, with a lot of initiatives on cyber diplomacy. All of the work that CISA has been doing from, secure by design, which we've talked a lot about, memory safe languages, election security, there really has been a lot of work done in the last 4 years.
And how much of that do you see as just a maturation of the field of cybersecurity and cybersecurity policy, such that, finally government is really taking this seriously? And how much of it do you see as the Biden administration, putting serious attention in areas that prior administrations of both parties have certainly spoken about? I think our colleague Jack Goldsmith once made a list of all the different presidents that had said that cybersecurity was the most important, area of, vulnerability, and yet nothing was done, or little was done. How much of this is a Joe Biden or Biden administration thing, and how much of it is just a kind of the world is maturing thing?
Well, I don't think those two are necessarily, opposed to each other. I think there's been a maturation, and, you can recognize the importance of cybersecurity for national security, for critical infrastructure. And then there's a political choice to either go find the people that are going to focus a lot on it and make it a priority, or not. And I think, that recognition paired with the Biden administration's decision to actually, staff a lot of people, actually hire a lot of people and engage with the issue, all of that contributed to all of the successes that we've been seeing.
And I assume the working assumption should be that a Harris administration is kind of status quo ante. Do we have any reason to think she's either more serious about it or less serious about it than Biden, or that does she have a cybersecurity brain trust that's substantially different from the people who are currently in office that we know of?
So we don't know a lot, so I am a little bit hesitant to make very strong predictions. But if we look at her campaign platform, we can notice that she does mention affordable internet as one of the campaign issues. And I think ensuring affordable internet access has important cybersecurity implications. So that is something that we can look at. This is also something that she has worked on as vice president. So it is interesting to see that being brought up into her presidential campaign as well. Some coverage has indicated that she's likely to put, and I'm quoting here, her own prosecutorial spin on Biden's already tough cybersecurity policy agenda. I think that is, that's a pretty good guess considering her track record, both in the Senate and as California's Attorney General. And again, even as a VP, she was engaged in questions of AI, of cybersecurity, and so forth. So I think I don't think she's going to be less serious about it than Biden. This would probably have, interesting implications for what regulation could look like. And we also know that, again, this is reporting, but her transition team has already started thinking, reportedly, about how to approach kind of, as you mentioned, you have the National Security Council, you have CISA, you have the Office of the National Cyber Director, all of them with kind of murky responsibilities around cybersecurity.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine that at least in the first instance, a bunch of people around her would stay in a Kamala Harris term. Or at least they wouldn't be replaced immediately. I can't imagine the highest priority of a new president-elect would be, to replace the head of CISA, right?
I can't imagine that either, but I can't really venture a guess.
All right, so let's talk about Trump, where it seems to me the range of possibility is dramatically larger. Has he I don't think he's talked much about cybersecurity during the campaign, save that his campaign was hacked by the Iranians. Do we have any reason to think this is a set of issues that's on his mind at all?
So it's interesting that you mentioned the attempted hack and leak from the Iranians, because even though he has talked about that and he's mentioned that, oh, they do this because they don't like me because I was strong against them, it doesn't really come across as a discussion about cybersecurity practices. It's more about the politics of it.
He frames it as an Iran thing, not
Exactly.
as a cybersecurity thing.
Yes. But again, our starting point being the candidates' platforms, one of his platform's priorities is actually to protect critical infrastructure, right? They talk about, quoting again here, they will use tools of national power to protect the nation's national critical infrastructure and industrial base from malicious cyber actors. So the fact that that is one of several priorities, I think, speaks to this, again, the continuity. This will remain a topic that the candidates are interested in. But he hasn't particularly, and I understand why, cybersecurity is not necessarily something that, I think votes are decided upon. Right.
So one other factor about Trump and cybersecurity, one of the reasons he was able to have a relatively productive term in this field is that he either intentionally or unintentionally hired very good people like Chris Krebs and his national security team on council team was reasonably competent. And I think because he didn't much care about the issue, he mostly left them alone. There's been a lot of talk in political circles about how that's not going to happen again, right? You're going to have much more aggressive loyalty tests, and then I guess by implication, people won't get left alone. I don't know of a universe of competent cybersecurity professionals who are in a position to swear these loyalty oaths. Is this a squarable circle, or is it reasonable to expect that he will simply not have access to he obviously won't have access to the Chris Krebses of the world, but to the people of that caliber, they're just not going to be available?
So I think he will have access to some caliber of professionals. There is reporting and interviews with both former cyber officials who worked under Trump who have said that they would be happy to go back and to work with him in a second administration. And I think there's been, if you look at some of the more conservative think tank work, there is engagement there. And that is a spectrum, right? Like, I think, like you mentioned at the beginning, we can either, expect continuity or there could be a complete overhaul. And I think a lot of that is going to depend on what is happening in the world, like what the context is. Is there going to be a reason for Trump to demand loyalty tests from cybersecurity officials? And again, this could just be, as we saw with Iran, it's going to be framed more as an Iran issue than a cybersecurity issue. But we don't know that. I would like to point, again, going to this range of things, something that we did not talk about is Project 2025. And I think that is one of the extremes where we see some conservatives being particularly concerned about the reach of CISA. It's unclear how much that is would become an issue in a second Trump administration. But it is something that a lot of experts have brought up. So I think there is some alignment even now between those positions and the experts that would be available to him.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point, that you are, talking about a domestic security agency, and people don't like to talk about CISA in those terms, but that is, among other things, what it is, and there's going to be some libertarian and conservative suspicion of that. So one last thing before we move on, I want to ask you about Russia. We've talked about Iran, where he frames cybersecurity in terms of Iran issues. But there's also the Russia stuff where he, has a tendency to deny that cybersecurity issues are real. Or at least to take on faith from a foreign dictator that cybersecurity issues are not real. And of course, the famous, you mentioned the Helsinki summit elite crack joint cybersecurity team, that grew out of a discussion at that press conference about, Putin assured me that Russia didn't hack the DNC and didn't steal John Podesta's emails. I think one of the risks here is that he simply doesn't acknowledge problems that are politically inconvenient for him to acknowledge. And I'm curious what's the capacity for Trump denialism and sort of self-delusion to kind of get in the way of good cybersecurity policy if he were president again?
Well, I think he has the capacity. Again, many of these decisions are going to be made at the political level. And if there are context reasons for him to, direct people towards or against what he considers important, those are the loyalty tests that you're talking about. And it's going to be up to whoever he brings in to, to counter it or not.
All right. I want to shift next to AI and to Kevin Frazier. This is a unique area of this conversation, Kevin, because there really, I don't think, was such a thing as AI policy during the Trump administration. It simply arose, like a year and a half ago. I'm sort of joking, but only sort of. But what do we know about continuity and difference between Trump administration instincts and Biden administration instincts on AI? And what do you see as you look forward to the two candidates on this issue?
Yeah, so I think this is actually a hotly contested topic among folks on the right in particular that feel as though Trump is perhaps not getting the credit he was due for initiating a lot of focus on AI. In retrospect, the 2019 executive order that Trump issued regarding AI looks like a really pivotal moment. If you go back and look at this executive order, you see calls for investment in AI, increased federal uses of AI, and global partnerships on AI. And you also see a lot of language pertaining to beating China in the proverbial AI race. And so folks on the right look back to Trump and say, hey, he was ahead of the curve with respect to making this a larger priority. And to the credit of the Trump administration, Congress did react to President Trump's calls for a greater focus on AI. In particular, we saw the passage of the National AI Intelligence Act of 2020, which established some important federal agency initiatives, namely NIST created an interagency committee The OSTP set up a AI office, and the Department of Energy started researching efforts to make sure that the US could continue to advance in AI development and deployment. And then finally, even the GAO was involved, initiating a study on procurement. And so this executive order and the subsequent action by Congress really does make for a compelling narrative for some folks that want to showcase Trump as a sort of leader in setting the US policy and really laying the groundwork for what we saw from the Biden administration. So we have that on one hand of kind of saying Trump was perhaps building regulatory muscle with respect to AI in a way that folks haven't really paid attention to. Of course, that was all before ChatGPT. So that executive order was at a time when folks were still thinking that quantum may still be as much of a conversation as AI, when emerging technology and 5G were all part of this broader conversation, and well before AI became the dominant focus of emerging technology policy. So then, of course, we had ChatGPT get introduced in late 2022, and the Biden administration, arguably, in the perspective of some folks, was building upon a lot of the efforts we saw under the Trump administration in launching its own executive order.
And just to be clear, you're framing this in the views of others. Is this your view? Like
This is not my view. I think this is intended to be a more neutral analysis of, if you do look back at this executive order, it's hard not to see the seeds for what we eventually saw germinate in the Biden executive order come about. Because
okay, but before we go that, I mean, I'm curious for your view, Kevin Frazier. How much credit does the Trump administration deserve? How significant was that, EO? Is it a situation where they looked and said, you know, as Alan would say, China, 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 we got to beat China. There's this thing called AI. Let's have an executive order that says beat China in AI. Or was this thing where they really saw something coming around the corner and created a baseline from which the Biden administration then worked?
I'd say it's, and this may not please folks looking for a definite answer. I am a law professor after all, so I have to say it's somewhere in the middle. There's fluff with respect to the idea that, for instance, the Trump frozen website covering its AI initiatives touts its ability, or touts focusing allies on AI by pointing to the fact that they got AI to be a topic on a G7 agenda. Is that really moving the dial? Not really. But if you have NIST setting up an interagency committee, if you have the OSTP setting up an AI office, I do think there's a compelling argument to be made that some of the infrastructure that Biden then built on was at least partially made possible by the Trump administration. But I think it's a difference of degree, where we saw the Biden administration take whatever the initial seeds were and really add some substance to it, add some resources and more of the general political will behind a lot of these initiatives.
And do we have a sense of, presumably it was not Donald Trump, who was I mean, I kind of know who the people are but like, who was the Ben Buchanans of the Trump administration who did this work?
I do think I don't have specific names. I'm not going to be able to name names here, but I would say it was more of that Peter Thiel-esque Silicon Valley group building up and supporting a more emerging technology focus and seeing that Trump could help shift the conversation towards some of these areas, but not necessarily engage with them on a substantive policy analysis of what, US AI doctrine should look like going forward. So he was a helpful conduit for a lot of these Silicon Valley interests looking for that greater investment. So I'd say generally those connections, with the absence of a specific name.
All right, so let's look forward. Let's pause a minute over the Biden administration, because it seems to me that they have done an enormous amount of work over a really short period of time, and the sophistication of some of that work as with the cybersecurity world, is substantial. So let's pause over the current administration. What can we say about their approach to AI governance?
Well, Alan told me that I couldn't talk for the entirety of the live stream. So I regret to not be able to dive into the full weeds of all that the Biden administration has done, because as you pointed out, Ben, it's a lot and it's a ton to cover. I think there are a couple things to really highlight. Number one, as I was indicating earlier, it would be that difference in degree in comparison to the Trump administration. If the Trump administration did plant some seeds, well, then the Biden administration laid the soil, added the water, provided the sunlight, and made sure that these initial initiatives grew into really meaningful policy. And we saw that not only in the executive order, but also with the CHIPS Act that the Biden administration really championed. And the CHIPS Act is probably the most important, in my opinion, policy we've seen come out of the Hill with respect to AI, because it did entrench this notion that we were engaged in a competitive AI race with China and with other adversaries. By making sure that the US maintains this control of the AI supply chain with its allies in Europe was a critical and pivotal move by the Biden administration that I think continues to be undercovered. Even though it derives a lot of attention, I think it deserves more to really show the focus by the Biden administration to make sure that AI innovation occurs in the United States and is not proliferating elsewhere. So there's the CHIPS Act, which we could talk about ad nauseum, and I'd love to. But then the EO itself and the recruitment of AI talent and resources across a number of different agencies really deserves attention. So the Department of Energy, for example, has been working with a lot of different national labs to make sure that we're leading on this question of the energy generation that's going to be required for AI development across the state. So that ongoing effort is quite pivotal, and the amount of investment there has been substantial. We've talked briefly about the Department of Commerce and the CHIPS Act. I think focusing also on NIST and now the creation of the US AI Safety Institute is another example of the Biden administration really acting on its efforts to be part of a global conversation about AI regulation. And we saw also the timing of the Biden EO on AI was also indicative of the US really trying to make sure it stayed relevant and at the fore of this governance conversation. Folks may recall that the Biden EO came out just before we saw the EU AI Act get established. And so by virtue of trying to lead on these questions and make the US relevant, Biden made sure that there was a real roadmap for where the US was going to go on AI policy.
All right, so let's look forward. Is there, again, same question as I asked Eugenia, is there any reason to think that Kamala Harris will be substantially different from Biden on this set of issues, or should we see her as likely to be kind of continued energy in this space in the same direction?
From what rumblings I've heard, the most likely effort by the Harris administration would be to codify the Biden EO. So more or less, we'd see status quo there. I think, though, that one of the more interesting signs of difference between Biden and Harris may be a focus on AI safety versus AI ethics and what are more well known as kind of current harms presented by AI. So under the Biden administration, we saw a lot of AI safety groups, which generally tend to be concerned with existential risks posed by AI or broader, more societal risks posed by AI. They got a lot of attention and had a lot of opportunities to make an influence on the Biden administration's policies. Harris on the campaign trail has said things like, well, isn't losing your healthcare for a discriminatory reason because of algorithmic bias, isn't that also an existential risk for an individual? And so we've seen a sort of shift away from a pure focus on AI safety or a predominant focus on AI safety to now under the Harris administration, a greater focus, or a potential Harris administration, greater focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, through the lens of AI. So I suspect that may be a greater focus under the Harris administration. We've also seen the FTC increasingly focus on algorithmic bias and other discriminatory uses of AI, especially with respect to things like price gouging and rental markets. There have been increased attention there under Chair Khan. So we'd have to see what happens to the FTC as well, which that's a whole nother can of worms.
One we're going to open momentarily with Kate Klonick.
I love it, and I know she's great at opening up worms or whatever we want to say there. Sorry, Kate. Teeing you up.
No, it's fine.
yeah. I'll send you a can of worms for your birthday. But no, so I think we'll see some interesting developments under the Harris administration. In contrast, the Trump administration, if anything, has been signaling that it's going to lean much more heavily into this sort of innovation focus with respect to AI. And so I'd expect that under a Trump administration, more framing around this AI race with China in particular would rise to the fore, and even greater efforts to keep supply chain control under the US and its allies would be top of the agenda as well.
Yeah, so let's talk about a Trump administration in AI. Again, the range of possibilities seems to me much greater, but I think you've put your finger on what the centerpiece of the policy goal would be. That is fundamentally to see AI not in terms of safety, not in terms of regulating algorithms, certainly not in terms of DEI, but in terms of competitiveness with China. Now, the Biden administration has already done a lot in terms of, as you pointed out, with the CHIPS Act, with sort of squeezing Chinese access to high value super chips. So what does a Trump, and Trump has been much more cautious than Biden in suggesting that he would not defend Taiwan, which is, of course, central to the AI and chips discussion. So my question is, should we expect, paper tiger Trump to show up? That is somebody who talks tough about, competition with China, but in fact is unwilling to do the things that you would actually have to do to take on China in this area, which specifically in the Taiwan Straits? Or is this an area that actually plays to Trump's strengths in the sense that he really, really wants to be the guy who's tough with China, and this is a trade policy issue, and he loves trade policy. So what do you expect from Trump in the AI world?
I'll give a short answer because I know Alan's keen to jump in here as well. My short answer would be that I do expect that congressional pressure is going to grow with respect to increasing the national security focus on our AI policy. And that's going to lend itself nicely to any administration that wants to focus on the US winning this arms race. We're already seeing, even in this potential impending lame duck session, a lot of conversations on the Hill percolating around how we can reinforce some of these initial export controls and continue to ensure dominance of that supply chain. So that would make Trump's job all the easier in terms of just kind of taking credit for whatever comes from the Hill if we continue to see this bipartisan consensus around winning the so-called AI arms race. I also think that there's a lot of room for Trump to expand upon his other foreign policy priorities. So there's a lot of partners to be made in the UAE, for example, across Europe, in terms of investing and spreading and building a broader AI coalition that I think would make Trump happy to see those tighter connections built with some allies he was attempting to recruit and build stronger relationships previously. But I'm keen to hear Alan's own 2 cents on this. Worth a nickel.
Yeah, I mean, Kevin gave a very thoughtful answer, and my answer is much less thoughtful. But I think there's a high chance of it being right, which is AI policy in the Trump administration will be whatever Elon Musk wants it to be. And I mean that
Plus two. I
extremely.
completely.
I would say
Yes.
I mean that
Completely correct.
extremely literally, right? I'm not making some like no. I don't mean like, oh, Republican. No. I mean like Elon Musk will just be given some portfolio, either officially or unofficially, and AI policy will be whatever Elon Musk wants it to be, which I think is probably as accelerationist as the term goes, as one can imagine it being, because, well, two things, because A, that's good for, you know, X for Elon's and X's bottom line. They're one of the big, they're maybe not in the absolute front rank of AI labs, but they're certainly in the sort of the top 5 or 6 or 7, if only because AI is really just a matter of scale and money at this point, rather than any sort of profound technological advances. And although they're all competing with each other, growing the pie is much more important than fighting over an existing pie, which means that it is in everyone's interest, whether you're, Elon or you're Sam Altman, whether you're a nonprofit or a B Corp or a safety person, or none of this matters, right? What matters to all of them is just growing AI as quickly as possible. So there's a financial incentive there for Elon. And there's also, I think, an ideological thing. I think, Musk, like along with a lot of these Silicon Valley types, really believe that AI is going to get us to the post-materialist, automated luxury communism of the future, and we should get there as quickly as possible. And so I would expect that it will just be 100% full steam ahead. They will defang the NIST AI Safety Institute, or AI Safety Institute will suddenly be all about innovation. Now, to be clear, I actually don't think that's that different from what a Harris administration would be. I think it's largely a change in rhetoric, right?
One side will wring their hands about it while they do it, and the other side will cheer for themselves while they do it.
Exactly.
Versa.
The Harris administration will spend a lot of time talking about DEI and AI, but nothing will actually change. But to the extent that these marginal differences matter, and they could, either from a competitive standpoint with China, or just from if you can increase the rate of increase by 0.5% on an exponential curve, that's real numbers really quickly. It's just going to be what Elon Musk wants it to be.
And I think we're already seeing the dominance of the AI labs in setting federal policy, which I just want to highlight once more. As Alan and I have covered alongside Dean Ball, for example, we already seen just sort of unprecedented actions by even Democratic officials in pushing back against state regulatory efforts. So the fact that we had Pelosi, Lofgren, and Khanna trying to prevent California from passing what many people would refer to as light touch AI policy is indicative of the fact that we do see innovation and national security foci winning the day on the Hill. And that's the cat's out of the bag in that regard. So long as China remains a threat, which under either administration, that's going to be the winning notion of the day. I think we're going to continue to see, as Alan's pointed out, just go, go, go. And the difference is really just, do we see some nice press releases about, but we also brought on some more initiatives to be nicer AI or something like that. But
yeah, is it wearing a MAGA hat or not, basically?
Right, exactly.
All right. We are going to turn at this point to the estimable Kate Klonick, and a subject that's a little bit off the beaten path for Lawfare, but I think is actually important to this conversation, which is antitrust policy. For those who don't know, Kate has been writing a very disruptive law review study of antitrust policy and big tech. Hey, this strikes me as the area, ironically, in which there may be the most continuity, in the sense that, if memory serves, it was the Trump administration that filed the antitrust litigation against Google. And it was and J.D. Vance, the one Trump administration official he speaks in praise of, is FTC Chair Lina Khan, who's one of the sort of gurus of the Biden administration's antitrust policy with respect to big tech. So how would you lay out this history?
Yeah, so this is super interesting. Antitrust, because, and this is kind of the little bit my gloss on how all of this has come along, but antitrust has had a real moment in the sun over the last let's say 4 years, primarily in my opinion because so little can be done to get at big tech through direct regulation because of the First Amendment, because of section and like this, or through through tort suit through because of Section 230. And so what you have is that finally, eventually, kind of people on the right and the left decided that the workaround for kind of coming at the power of big tech was to hit them where where the money was, and to specifically go after them from like an antitrust perspective. What's really interesting here is that, as you point out, two of like FTC Chair Khan's biggest kind of moments have come through cases that were initially brought by the Trump administration. That is, she had taken over the Facebook, Trump, now Facebook v. Biden case that was trying to unwind the WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook mergers. That is kind of like, that had some success, but then has been kind of a little bit dead in the water. There's, of course, the recent Google monopoly success that has really leveled some incredible fines and consequences for Google. And so what you have is kind of, in the last number of years, you've had some really big hits, both in rhetoric, frankly, and in cases brought by Khan against big tech enterprises. Now, a lot of those cases have not won. A lot of those cases have been out over, have made great headlines and made her and the FTC look very ambitious to outsiders unfamiliar with kind of antitrust law in going after big tech, for sure. But they have also, to people who are a little bit more read into how antitrust works, been seen as foolish and like a lack of resources, and really decrease the morale within the FTC and in antitrust land, regulatory land in general. And so that said, Lina Khan is was very young. She has had 4 years in office now. She's definitely getting her legs under her. There have been a number of smaller and what I would call low-hanging fruit cases that she has started to bring and had success on, at Amazon, against Snap, against some other types of things that are much more about consumer protection oriented kind of enforcement, which I think is really, really like some stuff, like, in my opinion, wish that is where she had let off in her whole administration, instead of trying to kind of do these grand, hugely resource intensive big tech cases that didn't really have backing in existing antitrust law. But that said, what is going to happen to like kind of this wonderkind Lina Khan is anyone's guess right now. Obviously she's going in a Trump administration, but even in a Harris administration. So as I mentioned, one of the things that has kind of, this is, and I'm sorry that this is, I guess if I'm going to get into it, no one really wants to know about like the legal antitrust doctrine around all of this, because it really hasn't changed that much. Like, there's not a whole lot of movement in the doctrine around antitrust. There is just a movement in kind of the politics that have been brought to it. So that's really the only, in my opinion, the only way to understand the last 4 years in Khan's administration is that the progressive left has really kind of taken on this and started to own. And there's an irony to this. I just want to point out there's an irony to this of like the left using antitrust and supposedly trying to free up competitive markets to make them maximally competitive to solve democracy problems. Because obviously there are some like direct democracy actions that you would want to take. But anyways, I digress. The main thing is that it's going to be interesting what happens in a Harris administration. Right now, people have been saying that quietly donors who are kind of a little bit more blue, like a little bit more centrist Democratic donors who are not as kind of wildly in favor of Khan's term in the FTC are quietly pushing for Harris to replace her when she comes through. And to that extent, you then had AOC, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, like come out and say like, if you do this, there will be hell to pay. We're going to rain down hell on everyone, whatever that means. If you can con, and so that is a little bit like what will happen in the Harris administration. Oddly, like I don't see a very different FTC under Trump either. Like, I think that Trump went after big tech really hard in his first term. He was not a typical Republican that kind of embraced a hands-off approach to antitrust. As I mentioned, he handed the FTC and handed over a number of cases against big tech, which she then chose to continue. And so, like, I honestly just think that this is really super fascinating. It does tie into AI, and I would love to kind of loop that in to kind of diversify this conversation. And it ties into a lot of, and I know this is a conversation about the presidency in the US, but it does tie into a lot of what's happening with the Digital Markets Act in the EU as well. And so there is a lot of movement and a lot of protectionism happening in private companies right now, and private tech companies trying to kind of protect their corner of innovation, and also like reacting very strongly to Khan's FTC that is a little bit European in theory and in practice. And, you know, it is anybody's guess where that goes, but Europe is doing Europe. And it's having a huge global effect on these companies and how they're basically rolling out packages, how they're investing in AI, and how they're investing in innovation. And so I just think it's been a really interesting puzzle to kind of watch from over here, and to kind of wonder about in the next couple of months.
All right. So a couple quick follow-up questions. One of the things about, you know, Trump's tough on big tech is that it got very mixed in with his personal interests. He hated Google because of, you know, he didn't like his search returns, right? And the Justice Department ends up suing Google. And Quinta will correct me if I'm misremembering this, but this was one of the issues where there were people in the Justice Department who, who thought it was improper and self-interested for him to be talking about this. How much of, on the other hand, J.D. Vance seems to actively admire Lina Khan, and he's talked about her as one of the few good officials in the Biden administration. So how much of this is a real convergence, and how much of it is just like the scatter associated with Donald Trump being super weird?
I think that's, I mean, in my opinion, I mean, there's no way to know. But I think that like it's a scatter effect. I don't think that there is much convergence. I don't think JD Vance knows antitrust from his elbow. So like, I'm not really particularly like, you know, I think that the reason he likes probably Lina Khan is because they both went to Yale Law School, and because they probably have like some mentors in common, to be perfectly honest. And some people, and like, you know, who knows? But like also like he might like her because she does have, and this is again back to my point of like kind of like the weird lack of daylight between the left and the right in this antitrust moment right now against big tech. That is also like this kind of great irony for the left, is that you have this progressive left pursuing a policy that is like, you know, the best way, we should trust the markets. Like that is at its core, like what antitrust is telling you to do. Like antitrust law is, we need to free up the markets. And of course, this goes back and forth, but like the idea is use antitrust in order to free up the markets so that capitalism solves these problems of the people. And it's like a deep irony that you have a progressive kind of front right now that is also trying to like use that type of language to, I think it's an irony. I mean, I'm not the only one who kind of like has pointed out this paradox, but this paradox to kind of like to free up to free up this market and to create a better online world. Now, one of the things that, Ben, I've talked about is like, does it create a better online world to have a lot of smaller platforms? This is something that I've talked about with Quinta and with Alan at various points, like in the past. Like, is it better? It sounds insane to say we should have like a handful of very large platforms that bind us all together, and then impose direct regulation on them or some type of regulation on them. But I'm kind of increasingly like, no, actually, really a ton of really small platforms and the markets are not the best way to effectively manage content moderation and solve the issues of online speech on private platforms. But like that puts me in this weird position politically, and it really kind of is it's a strange kind of water to be swimming in, I guess.
Right. Kate Klonick living at the bend in the horseshoe.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Am
Kevin.
I living in the bend in the horseshoe? Or am I like in the little gap between?
No, you're right in the bend from which
Yes,
JD Vance and Lena Khan both tail away.
Yes.
Kevin.
Yeah, I think to jump in on that AI question in particular, I think there might be a slight difference with respect to how an FTC under Harris and an FTC under Trump would approach the AI question. And the best read of that for me is from the recent do not pay decision rendered by the FTC. So that was pertaining to a new legal AI app that claimed to basically be able to file anything and everything for folks in a really seamless and accurate way. Under Chair Khan, the administration the commission voted on a 5-0 basis to move forward with that complaint and say that do not pay was acting in a fraudulent fashion. What's really important, though, is that the concurrence issued by Commissioner Ferguson, one of the two new commissioners that we see for the R's, so Commissioner Ferguson and Commissioner Holyoke, a focus by Commissioner Ferguson on making sure that the FTC doesn't read too heavily or too expansively into its mandates to quash AI innovation. So I still think there's some degree of difference with the comfort of market intervention on the right and on the left. Here that could really diverge under a Harris administration or a Trump administration. And in particular, seeing the extent to which the right either continues to adopt or continues to have some degree of skepticism with whether to abandon the consumer welfare standard under Bork or to perpetuate in a slightly different way the neo-Brandeisian framework that Khan has kind of outlined. I think the trend is drifting towards broader adoption of the neo-Brandeisian framework kind of across the board, as we see increased interest by folks like Commissioners Holyoke and Ferguson in more of the legislative history of the Sherman Act, trying to get at regulation of bigger companies or companies that are dominant in certain spaces. But it's just colored with a certain focus continuing to be on innovation and making sure that there's heightened competition that I don't think we'll necessarily see as keyed up under a Harris FTC.
Yeah, I would say that I think it's very light. I think that the actual courts are not taking the neo-Brandeisian like things into, and yes, I'm reading the same reports out of the FTC that you are. I'm seeing the same guidelines and recommendations. There is slight change in language. Herb Havenkamp has some a very kind of, as the godfather of antitrust, just a very straightforward reading of kind of some of the guidance that the FTC has put out that does have a little bit of that language. But I think it's lighter around the edges than people think. And I don't know if it'll last through an FTC that's not chaired directly by Khan or one of her denizens, whoever that might be. And so I do think that there's, like, that being said, to your point about AI, I think that we're getting a little bit putting like the antitrust apple cart in front of like the horse to bring in horses again and whatever.
We're just horsing around so much, Kate.
I know.
That's all we're really doing.
But I really do want to say that, like, I just think So first of all, there's the main way that antitrust or the FTC would have a role in AI. And correct me if like either of you disagree with me right now, but this is not like, these are not monopoly concerns, right? Like those are years and years off of like being kind of understood, which is what the neo-Brandeisians really make their bread and butter about. What like the concerns right now around AI, around consumer safety and consumer access and consumer safety, and fraud and abuse. And all of those things are directly like, those are in tension with this idea of you want, first of all, AI innovation. Second of all, how do you get AI in? Like, here's this constant tension that we're going to come back to probably when we talk about content moderation in a second. But this tension between a centralization providing safety and decentralization being kind of a wild, wild west, in which you have like LLMs that are being put out into the ether that anyone can train up and use, and like are releasing all kinds of deep fake pornography or sextortion things for 15-year-olds or whatever else it is that's kind of happening. And so the problem here is that I just think that, and I will also say the powers that be, everyone wants a piece of the AI hype machine, and every government right now wants to be the place where these things are built and be the place, even like the EU right now. I mean, like France right now is just like chomping at the bit to bring in kind of and have this be the thing that bucks the kind of the wisdom of the EU can't innovate. Right? They want AI to be this thing, and they have like their golden child, Jan LeCun, who's like at Meta and doing AI, who is like, you know, they have a lot of reason to think that they could bring the tech and the talent here. But anyways, my point is that this is like, I think that like the antitrust conversation around AI, you really have to split it, because this in two very, very different places from a substantive standpoint right now.
All right. Turning to our last subject matter area, content moderation, which doesn't seem like a policy area, except that it clearly is. We went from we have had completely different environments in the content moderation space and social expectations of policy during the Trump administration, during this administration, and I expect in the next administration. And Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter suggests that those will be very different environments, that the stakes here really matter. So Quinta, walk us through what the Trump administration did, what the Biden administration has done, and what we can reasonably expect here. Again, with this proviso that formally it's not the government that does any of these things, it's the platforms.
I think it's a little hard to address these questions in part because it requires, treating the Trump administration as a unitary entity, which of course it wasn't. So, when we talk about what the Trump administration did on these areas, I think there are really sort of separate questions that we need to consider in terms of the rhetoric that was coming out of the White House, and sometimes specifically just coming from the Oval Office, versus the actual actions that were taking place on the sort of agency level. So when we think about the White House, Trump, of course, was very adversarial toward technology companies near the end of his time in office, really doubled down on the idea that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act should be repealed, and was quite aggressive, especially on that language of censorship, which really kicked up after he left office in 2021, but you see the seeds of that early on. On the other hand, a lot of the actions that Republicans now point to as, instances of censorship coming out of DC were actually things that happened, from the FBI, for example, or from CISA while Trump was in office. So, you know, that coordination between government entities in advance of the 2020 election, trying to alert platforms of potential foreign interference, that kind of thing. That was under the Trump administration, of course. So I do think that that's important to keep in mind. It's a little difficult to say what things might look like under a future Trump administration because, you know, we just don't have much of a sense. Senator Vance has been very critical of Section 230. Trump, I will say, has kind of quieted down about it, or at least I haven't seen very much from him on the topic. I think the rhetoric has really shifted more toward this language of censorship, which of course you also saw Vance bring up at the end of the vice presidential debate. So I think it's really a question mark. On the question of Harris as a, you know, what that would look like and how it might differ from or be a continuation of the Biden administration. Again, I think there's been, you know, sort of some thunderous rhetoric from President Biden, certainly, on what he sees as a need to reform or repeal Section 230. That's been a little quieter recently. I will say that the Democratic Party platform, which was sort of prepared for President Biden and then kind of passed over to Harris Walls, I believe, with some edits, does still include a line about the need to fundamentally reform Section 230. I don't think it's particularly clear about what that would look like or what the goals are, but that is in there. And it's also true that, you know, Harris is somebody who has been hard on tech platforms in the past in her role as California Attorney General. She signed a letter asking the Justice Department to allow attorneys general to file suit despite Section 230 against tech platforms. She was very influential in the passage of Sesta FOSTA, the Section 230 carve-out having to do with sex trafficking that's received a lot of criticism. Of course, that was a while ago, so I don't have a sense of whether or not there's a continuation there, but that is worth, you know, keeping in mind. Beyond that, I don't think we really have very much of a sense of what a Harris-Wells administration would look like in this space beyond, you know, the issues that we've already talked about, right? I think to the extent that there's rhetoric here, it's really on the realm of, you know, antitrust, as Kate was discussing, AI. There is some material in the platform regarding, you know, the need for child safety legislation. So perhaps we would see more on that, but nothing that I think is a huge divergence from what we've already seen from the Biden administration.
Alan?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything Quinta said, and I would just add that I think one reason why we might not expect a lot of legislative action on 230, in addition to it being like an insanely hard problem to actually write down something that you could then get majorities in the House and the Senate and the White House to sign on to, is because I think actually the courts might do this for them, which is to say there's been a lot more ferment in the federal courts about what Section 230 means. And the kind of what one would call the traditional consensus, Section 230 is extremely broad and immunizes against, you know, not just third-party content, but recommendations. I mean, immunizes against basically everything on social media. I think that is crumbling. You're seeing a lot more courts being willing to read Section 230 much more narrowly. I mean, you had a big opinion out of the Third Circuit recently that basically read Section 230 in a much more narrow way. And so either, you know, we can imagine there being a consensus on 230 shifting in a much more narrow direction. I think the Supreme Court will ultimately have to re-engage with this issue. It tried, obviously, in Gonzalez versus Google and then utterly failed to do so. But at some point, there's just going to be a very clear circuit split on a very clean Section 230 question of what does it actually cover. And the Supreme Court will probably have to address that. And so I think while the courts are revisiting this issue, that takes a lot of pressure off of Congress to do anything. And then you add that to the fact that the Section 230 reform is just a really hard problem. I suspect we're not going to see that much coming out of either administration.
All right. So there is, I want to push you both on this because there is another non-regulatory form of presidential action in this space. And we saw it in both the Trump administration and in the Biden administration. And it's what's colloquially called jawboning. And it was, of course, litigated. we can talk, I don't want to talk about the individual examples, but Trump is very open, that if you don't run content that he likes, he'll go after your benefits or your licenses, or, he'll make your life difficult somehow. And the Biden administration was, obviously concerned about COVID misinformation. I don't mean to draw an equivalence between the two, but presidents have a lot of ways of communicating displeasure and pleasure and requests to platforms. And so, Quinta, my question in this area is it even really ultimately a matter of policy, or is it just in the case of Trump that, if you're a platform, you're going to have to get ready for a lot of bullying?
In the case of Trump, I think that's probably fair. I mean, I think that that's probably especially the case because given that now Twitter is, of course, owned by Elon Musk and Trump himself is a owner of a platform in the form of Truth Social, it's going to be more difficult for the administration to sort of identify tech platforms generally as enemies. And I don't think there's really a easy way to draw a line that separates the tech platforms you like from the tech platforms you don't. And so that may perhaps suggest that sort of a pressure based on, whatever is motivating Trump's thinking at that particular moment is more likely. I will say that since the Supreme Court's ruling in Murphy v. Missouri, which kind of formally kicked the can down the road on this job owning issue, but did give some indication of how the court is thinking about the issues. The FBI has a new page on their website that essentially sets out public guidelines that the Bureau is committing to following in terms of its interaction with tech platforms. And so I do think that, you could see some kind of systematization that we might expect from a Harris administration if they decide to, keep up that that system. I don't know if I would expect to see that continued or abided by in a Trump administration, but I do think that we have seen some movement toward a more sort of transparent, rule-bound form of interaction with platforms on behalf of the government.
All right. We have just a few minutes left and we have 3 questions. I do want to get to them all. The anonymous attendee asks, what is the outlook for data privacy under a possible second Trump term? In particular, what protections are in place to prevent, for example, a platform especially friendly to Trump from indiscriminately handing over protected data to federal law enforcement agencies on flimsy national security grounds? Kevin, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that data privacy will continue to be led by the states under either administration. I think this is the issue that continues to be kind of a third rail that we just haven't been able to get a consensus on here. In particular, the odds of an FTC rule on commercial surveillance rule issued by the FTC, I think might sort of crowd out additional consideration by Congress for data privacy. So I wouldn't say that we're necessarily going to see a huge rush forward on comprehensive data privacy under either administration. But we have seen I believe it's called the APR, the American Privacy Rights Act, introduced by Klobuchar, excuse me. That was introduced late this session and appears to be garnering some bipartisan support. The odds of a bill led by Amy Klobuchar getting through the Hill under a Trump administration, though, under a potentially Republican Senate, though, seems quite low. So, again, I wouldn't expect a whole lot of movement on data privacy from the Hill.
Also, there are no restrictions on a private company who wants to give data to the government to do so. And there never will be.
All right. Joel Woodward, your question.
Joel asked us to read it out loud. He doesn't have a mic.
Oh. Joel writes, I have heard a great deal of concerns expressed in the political process about narrow AI Do you see a discussion of general AI being a more prominent topic for the major parties in current campaigns? Alan, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. No, in that I don't think someone's going to come out and make general AI or AGI or whatever, or these big safety issues a key part of their plank. Just, normies don't care. Maybe they should, but they just don't. And you would it'd be very weird to come out and like spend a bunch of your stump speech talking about the importance of preventing Skynet. Like you'd just be laughed at, I think. At the same time, I do think that it's very much part of many of the very concrete policies that both parties are going to be dealing with. For example, China competition, infrastructure investment, all that sort of stuff. They're not going to talk about general AI. They might mention AI generally, because I think at this point enough people have used ChatGPT to know what at least kind of narrow artificial intelligence can look like. So that's how I suspect this will be discussed.
All right, Don Steinebach, you have the last question.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
I was just wondering, I'm listening to you from Germany in Europe. And my question is basically concerning what the candidates, either or both of them, will do during their coming term with regard to tech policy, and also given the fact that there seems to be in Brussels a lot of discussion about industrial policy and more investment in the tech economy, trying to, what Kate mentioned, to pull that more towards the European economy. Will there be an aggressive reaction from Trump or Harris, like we've seen from Biden on the trade with China in tech, or will they be diplomatic about it?
All right. Alan, do you have thoughts on this, or Kevin?
Yeah, I do. So I think that, and I mean no offense here, I think that America continues to deeply not care about the European tech sector. I mean, to be clear, I think some of that's short-sighted. I think a lot of that is actually appropriately to recognize the fact that the EU has really not invested in tech innovation. And if it does, that's great. But when you just look at the number of companies that are coming out of the EU from the tech sector, when you look at how much more interested Brussels seems to be in regulating AI in Europe rather than actually building AI in Europe, I just don't think America views Europe as, frankly, a particular competitor. And I don't think it should. I wouldn't, frankly, if I was in the administration. Now, I do think that there are parts of the European economy that matter a lot, right? Data flows of, especially for US tech companies, has always mattered. Whether the EU buys from China and, buys into the Chinese ecosystem, that stuff matters. But that's much more the EU as a consumer, not as a producer/competitor. I would love for that to change, because the more people working on this stuff, the better, but I don't think it will in the foreseeable future.
We are going to leave it there, because Lawfare Live begins and ends on time, and it is time to end. We will be back. We're going to do at least one more of these events before the election itself. You can get your question answered if you're watching this on YouTube by becoming a material supporter, whether you're in Germany or in France or in Tahiti. You can have your question answered on Lawfare Live. Join the inner circle in our actual studio. We'll be back. Thank you to Kevin Frazier, to Alan Rozenshtein, to Quinta Jurecic, to Eugenia Lostri, and to Kate Klonick for joining us